Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you're joining us from. Thanks for being on the phone with us today for our Stantec Water webinar series. Today, we're going to be talking about adapting to 21st century water resources challenges, building on lessons learned from complex water supply projects. My name is Ryan Murdock. I'm a marketing director here at Stantec. I'll be your moderator. A few housekeeping items before we get started. First, you'll be muted during the presentation, but you can ask questions or put in a comment at any time using the GoToWebinar questions option. We will read those at the end. With about 15 minutes left, we'll get into the Q&A. If your question ends up not being answered, we'll follow up with you directly after the event and answer your questions that way if we just have too many to get to. I'll also follow up, usually within a week or two, with a certificate of attendance that you can use to submit for professional development hours. Obviously, it's up to the local registration agency if they'll accept that or not, but we will give you one for your use. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Mr. Bill Swanson, and he will take us away. Go ahead, Bill.
Good morning or afternoon to everyone, and thank you so much for joining this conversation today. What we'd like to talk about today are some of the challenges that we're facing as we think about complex water resource decisions, projects, policies, initiatives, infrastructure development in today's environment. We have three panelists that will be participating today. Myself, I lead the water resources planning practice for Stantec. Ryan Murdock, who leads our water supply planning management subsector, and Lisa Beutler, who's an executive facilitator. And you'll be able to hear from all of us as we introduce ourselves as we work our way through this conversation today. Let me begin though with a foundational discussion on safety. At Stantec, we take safety very, very seriously, and it's embedded within our culture. And one of the ways that we think about it throughout everything we do is we ask our staff to, and our clients and all people working with us, to think about safety in the context of the release of energy. And I'm not going to go through this in great context, but you can kind of get a sense just by looking at what we call the energy wheel of the kinds of the types of hazards and how they can be characterized, whether it's in a simple setting in an office or a complex setting on a dense construction site, or perhaps out in a natural environment with a variety of biological and radiation, heat or thermal hazards. And so as we work with our staff in thinking about preparing health and safety planning, we ask them to evaluate the circumstances in the context of each one of these potential hazards or ways in which energy could be released. And it's a very, I have found it to be a very eye-opening approach to considering hazards, and sometimes in ways that you might not have thought about in the past. So I'd encourage everyone to think of it more comprehensively. We certainly do, and we take it very seriously. So with that, I want to hand this over to Lisa to begin our conversation today.
Great, thank you so much. Once again, my name's Lisa Beutler, and I spend most of my time working with communities and organizations to help them manage change, to make large decisions and create strategic actions. So, and during the last 20 years, most of my work is really focused on the water sector as the demands for water continue to increase and the reliability of existing water supplies is just stretched more than most people are able to manage. One of the things that the energy wheel demonstrates is several of the principles that we're actually going to be talking about today. One of them is the idea that we need to assess our situations holistically with an eye to risk. Also, that we need to consider all of the elements. While we understand a potential safety risk, if properly managed, risk can actually be assets. And the key for all of this is pay attention to what you're working with and really pull in the whole picture before you get started. So Bill explained that we're going to be focusing on the approach to develop and manage the next iteration of water management. So I guess part of what we'd like to ask you, is this actually something you need to think about? So I'll have Bill go to the next slide. And here's some simple questions that you can ask yourself to see whether or not this makes some sense for you. The first one being, is there going to be a plan or initiative project in your future? We're going to guess yes, because you're in this session with us. And then the next question would be, is it 100% under control? And if you answered yes to that, my answer would be, are you sure? If you need a regulator to approve it, if you don't, good for you. And the same would go to the elected bodies or the regional potential for someone to litigate. Importantly, though, we also want to ask you, do you intend to have a long-term relationship with this community? And we're going to talk more about what a community is and how to do that. The biggest takeaway, and you all know the answers to the questions, so the biggest takeaway from all of this is that in today's environment, other people think your business is their business. And so that's something to look at. So Bill's going to talk about in a minute, he's going to talk about the times have changed. And just to give you a sense of what he's going to talk about, I'll go to the next slide. And we're almost there, almost to that next slide. Oh, I can see your cursor moving, Bill. Uh-oh, there it is. There's the next slide. So the times have changed. And a part of our question to you is have they really? We're going to be thinking about the idea that at one point in time, you know, we had different ways of doing things. Phil, again, is going to talk more about this. But going alone is no longer possible. So we're still on the road, but the way that we're getting there is the thing that's changing. So we'll go ahead and move to the next slide. Our premise is that our infrastructure projects have always been based on community values. We don't think that this has changed. We just think maybe what has changed is the definition of a community and the things that the community actually values. So hopefully at the end of this presentation, you're going to walk away with 3 key ideas. One of them is that building is the easy part, really. You all are very good at what you do. You have a lot of expertise, and you wouldn't be in the positions you're in if you didn't do that. Partnerships are going to be essential, and the upfront strategy is foundational. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Bill to keep talking a little bit about, you know, what's changed. Why are we in a new world?
Thanks, Lisa. Let me give a little more background on myself. As I mentioned, I lead the water resources planning practice for Stantec. I'm a civil engineer by education, but early in my career, when I was working on construction and design projects, I came to the recognition that, as Lisa mentioned, that's actually kind of the comparatively easy part of moving a project forward. The much more challenging part is getting agreement on what you're going to do and getting the buy-in from everybody that has a role in that. Most of my work has been related to water supply planning, much of it in the Western United States, but really throughout the US. I've also done work on flood control, ecosystem restoration projects, touched on recreation, hydropower. So I've kind of run the gamut of multi-purpose projects. Most of my work has been large watershed basin scale projects. And they all are exceptionally complex. Few projects that I've worked on have actually been for single entities. Most have been through partnerships, and that revealed the need for, you know, thinking from the point of view of everybody who would be involved. You know, so the impetus for today's discussion has been some of the things we're aware of around water scarcity in the Western US, but the reality is that the principles that we're talking about today really apply to any complex water resources decision. Because often we tend to think of the decision as around the infrastructure, but when you pull back and really think about it, the decision is about the way in which we're going to allocate the use of our natural resources. And so the role of the stakeholders and the participants is much more complex than perhaps it used to be. So as an example to this, you know, we think about the way in which our society has developed around water. It began, like much of our society has begun, with a focus on resource extraction, building large projects, putting land to use. You know, some of the themes that people have heard in the past: manifest destiny, settling the arid West, doing God's work. The concept of the developer of water resources solely for the purpose for human benefits, economic benefits, was a very high priority. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what led to the economy and the environment and the society that we have today. Were it not for that, we wouldn't have the country we have today. But as that work occurred, in that era, there was also a high degree of trust and confidence that the entities that were charged with doing that work could be trusted. And so there was a high degree of confidence that the large federal agencies like the Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation, that they were doing the right thing and they were going to bring water resources and water capability to our society. As time has gone on, we've recognized that some of those projects, particularly the cumulative effect of them, have led to undesirable outcomes. And that coincided with an era of environmental awakening in the 1960s, 1970s, that we all know led to a tremendous amount of the legislation that we work with today. Environmental protection, water quality protection, air quality protection, and so on. And so that period, though, also coincided with the requirement, if that's the way to put it, of bringing additional stakeholders to the table. And not everybody embraced that with open arms. There was a lot of conflict that we all have seen through this environmental awakening era, where bringing other views to the table was often viewed as an obligation or a necessary evil or something we have to do, as opposed to something that we should embrace. And so that itself has led to conflict, and it's created some attitudes that really haven't always been that productive in moving projects forward. There's some entities think, well, I'm going to develop my project the way I want to, and if those who oppose me want to oppose me, I will litigate to get a permit, I will mitigate, and I will just go forward. More and more we find, though, that approach to projects doesn't really work so well. As you think about where we are today, I would argue that we're entering an era of sustainable resource management. And that's partly due to changing social values, but it's also supported by the wide availability of information. Today, everybody has access to all information. Information travels very, very quickly, and collaboration among like-minded entities happens very immediately. And so that creates an environment where the role of the participants in projects is different today than it might have been in past years. And so it might be helpful for us then to think about, when we think about projects, what do we mean? Often, a project is kind of viewed as the physical infrastructure that we want to build. But as we know, the kind of a focus on just the infrastructure and not thinking about its comprehensive effects can lead to a lot of conflicts. It can lead to a perception of winners and losers, or a perception of imbalanced outcomes. We also know that the projects that we're thinking about today, or the actions that we want to go forward with, are not easy, and they're not simple. The low-hanging fruit, you would say, of water resource and development has been picked a long, long time ago. Most actions that are taken today or contemplated today have been thought through by a lot of agencies. If you look at strategic water plans for water utilities or large basin managers, they're very well thought out plans. And many of the actions that are identified are not singular actions, they're interdependent with others. And they require the participation and partnership with others, and very few single projects, single entities, single purpose projects that are even possible these days. But one thing to keep in mind is that in that forward planning and thinking about what we want to do, what kind of projects we want to do, it's very likely that all of the stakeholders that will be affected were not really at the table. And so as we think about going forward by implementing a decision that's already been made, there will be numerous participants who come to the table who say, well, you may have made a decision, but I really haven't had a chance to weigh in yet. And so as we think about projects today, it's really beneficial to think of them in the context of all the way to the end. You know, what is the end point we're trying to get to? Who has to be involved, and what resource decisions, what financial decisions, what technical proofs, what financial considerations, what social responsibilities need to be contemplated. So I'd like to hand it over to Ryan to talk a little bit about how we go about balancing those challenges.
Thanks, Bill. I'm Ryan Murdock. I've worked across several Western U.S. states, kind of from Texas to Nevada and Utah and California and Oregon, on major water supply planning and feasibility and permitting projects. Fun things like dam and reservoir development or enlargements, major conveyance, basin scale operations modeling, and integrated water resources planning. And when we think about kind of the era that we're in today, as Bill sort of set us up with, there's certainly a myriad of topics that need to be considered for any water supply project development. And this represents just some of them. Certainly, we suggest that we as water professionals really need to think about how a project is going to be approved and consider everything that will be required from the very beginning. So that's one of the first kind of key strategies that we recommend. And how do we start in that process? I just like to think of kind of as Stephen Covey's taught, to begin with the end in mind. And in this case, the end is the outcome that you're seeking, whether that be a specific decision to be made on resource allocation or a permit approval or the benefit that you want to receive, not necessarily the project itself. The project enables an outcome, of course, like public health and safety through improved water supply reliability, for example. But we really need to spend enough time up front on the goals of the project, the problems that we're trying to solve. Early in my career, and quite often, repeatedly, a wise person, a coworker, had a lot of experience in planning, taught me that a problem well defined is half solved. And I've sort of adopted that. And even though most people really want to get as quickly as possible to the fun stuff of design and construction, to truly be able to get to that with these complex, to get to that point successfully in these complex projects, we really need to be thoughtful and have a vision up front. So the upfront strategy is certainly foundational, or maybe in other words, you need to be willing to go slow to go fast, to be able to be deliberate and methodical in how you're laying out that strategy so that you really can be firing on all cylinders when it's time to get the permits and go through detailed design and construction. So if we break that down a little bit further, don't be tempted to jump to these solutions too quickly, although of course we all have lots of ideas in mind, and don't be tempted to make decisions that are really based only on your own criteria. It's important to have a shared understanding or a common problem definition, not just with yourself, but with all of your partners, including other stakeholders and agencies, and sometimes, of course, even just getting everyone around the table at your own project proponent to see things the same way, because nobody wants to be accused of having a solution in search of a problem. We really need to be thinking about this as kind of having a fundamental, quantified, substantiated need for taking a certain action and be able to separate that from maybe what's more of the want or wish list. It's also important to acknowledge some of the challenging realities and sensitive issues. I mean, every project has them. We don't, whether that's property or landowner concerns, water rights issues or endangered species, or just challenging past relationships with the community, whatever that is, don't avoid that. Confront those realities and work through it early on. Whether that's a mix of fact and perception, we just need to kind of work on it and recognize it. And so the spectrum sometimes that we inherit on certain projects of how you might approach a project development is almost what I would call reverse engineering in some experience. Just kind of, we've already made a decision, but let's now go through the planning and permitting process to prove that our decision is right. But in today's environment, we really need to move more towards the approach of let's work together to figure out what the best decision is. And kind of the second key point or strategy that I wanted to hang off of this is that success in project development is largely about the environment in which the technical work is done and the interface between the engineering, the environmental, and the public acceptance. And so we need to execute work processes in parallel rather than in series, and develop information for several decisions, whether that be the technical feasibility, the permitting, or the outreach, using kind of a consistent approach for all participants. So of course, great engineers know how to design and build projects, but often a different skill set's really required to think of these projects more comprehensively, and we can see it as a planning development process that includes permitting and recognizes risk and uncertainty. Probably too often, or on some occasions, emphasis on the project facilities and costs has dominated the planning, where the requirements for permitting and public acceptance were viewed as more of a compliance or checkbox requirement rather than as integral to the project development and influencing the outcome, almost wanting to have that certainty on where this is all going. But as Lisa also mentioned, building in and embracing risk and uncertainty can be an asset. Challenge your assumptions. Once you have a clear problem definition, ask the what if questions through scenario planning to understand your existing problems and your risks and vulnerabilities. That can help you select the best solution that can perform under a range of conditions, or understand the trade-offs if you might reach different solutions under different scenarios. But it can also help you establish more precise metrics that are customized to your needs. So I guess in summary, this approach really starts with more of a philosophy and a commitment, more so than like a guidebook, just to be willing to think through all these activities and touch points all the way through, more than just the engineering details, and bring in the perspectives of the partners in a transparent process. Since transparency can certainly be just as important for establishing your credibility as your recognized objective expertise. So regardless of where you are in your process, and whether your initiative might be focused on like a Western water supply or something like flood mitigation in the Midwest, you need a robust strategy and be willing to kind of embark on a journey to work through the technical and all of the human components. So with that, I'll pass it to Lisa to talk a bit about that element.
Thanks. Thank you so much. I'll have you go to the next slide, Bill. So we're going to ask some more questions to all of you. Our hope is that at this point, the idea that we have to get other people on board is going to be critical to success is part of that. But here's some other things that you can ask, or if you're working with an elected official or someone else that's maybe not as interested, you can ask, would a poor execution harm our organization? Is there a potential for activism by others? Have we had poor interactions with people in the past? And by the way, this is going to be a predictor if you don't do quite a bit of work. What kind of trust issues are we going to have? And here's another one in terms of timing and some of the other kinds of projects we work on. Could we get caught in the middle of somebody else's fight? We really need to be examining what's happening before we jump into something. So let's go to the next slide, Bill.
Yep.
So part of what we want to do is we want to really start a process of considering an interest-based approach. What kinds of issues and interests are out there? How does our project fit into that context? So the first thing we do is sort of examine what's being proposed. I'll talk about that in just a minute, some ways of thinking about that. Where's it going to happen? And you need to look at not just the physical location of your actual facility or whatever it is that you are engaged in your project process. So as a simple example, right now I'm working on two treatment plant facilities, one's in an urban space, one's in a more rural setting. And we're needing to do, there's all the normal stuff you look at, like, construction, traffic, and those kinds of things. But we're also having to look much broader. We're using river intake systems. Of course, we're needing to take a look at that part of it. But we're also worried about labor. And labor, where we're going to source that. We are worried about cement, and we are worried about funding sources. So our project is much bigger than the physical place that project's happening. The other thing is really understanding who the stakeholders are. What kind of stakeholders are they? Are they parts of the community? Are they potential partners? Are they potential suppliers? Are they potential regulators? What do they care about? Who are the people they trust? Who do they listen to? Who could bring them information on our behalf? How do we best connect with those people? How should we be talking to them? Is there a sensitivity around timing? What do we need to know from the people? So not only are we trying to share information, we're trying to extract it. When is this all going to occur? Why will it matter to them? How can we actually build a value equation? And then what kind of methods are we going to be using? What kinds of technologies? And by the way, if we were taking a look at a project that was perhaps using some innovative technology, all of a sudden our project might involve a collaborative of other people interested in similar kinds of technology. So our whole sense of what a project is and where it's happening could be very different. There's another way of extracting some of where the values are and who else might be part of your process. Let's go to the next one. So every water project will have typically one of these 4 elements. These 4 parts of the circle that are in the orange circle, this represents the things that are drivers of community values. So a community is going to be concerned about their health and safety. They have a value set around that. They have one about the economic setting. They have one about the environment. The other one, culture and enrichment. This is sometimes a surprising one to some people, but what this is about is recreation is probably an obvious one, but more and more we're beginning to understand that there may be some tribes that will have an interest in what we're doing, and there may be some cultural values that are quite important, and that will really impact what's going to happen with your project. There are other things. I'm thinking of a project right now in Texas where the view shed and the sense of access to where the water is and how that might be important to people's peace of mind. There are a lot of different ways. Still another project, we're looking at improving the labor force composition. So there's a huge cultural thing happening physically in the construction by bringing in an entirely new way of thinking about apprenticeships. So culture could be much bigger and much different than the way that you would normally think about it. So one of the things that I like to do when we're working on a project is sit down and help the proponents of the project think through what is the value equation. How do we create value for the community? Once we understand what those components are, then we can go backwards from that and say, who else is going to be involved? Who else might bring assets to the very thing that otherwise might be considered a liability? So that's the way that we think through these projects. The other thing that we like to do is ask people to remember that there are different parts of your project depending on where you're on that construction piece. So the first one is the actual thing you're trying to get, the actual outcome that you're trying to get to, the needs you're trying to meet. The second part is your proposed solution or your proposed implementation message. Those are all very different types of processes to determine what the interest and the value-based equation might be. So with that, we want to make sure we just dissect that and we are paying attention and testing for both. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Bill, and he's going to kind of give us some takeaways. And then we'll talk a little bit more about, can you actually do this? Can you actually do this in the water sector? So Bill, can you do this in the water sector?
I think we can, and I see some evidence that that's truly happening. Let me give you a little story about the San Joaquin Valley in California. It's a very large agricultural area. It's about, my gosh, over 10,000 square miles of irrigated agriculture in a contiguous stretch of land that's about 250 miles long, about 50 miles wide. This is just a visual. It's just kind of an indication of the dense development of agricultural land use in the region. And this has been the case progressively the case over the past 100 years, and it's really at a crest right now. But the valley suffers from some pretty serious water challenges. Over the past 40 years, the reliability of water supply that's imported to the valley from Northern California has decreased, and largely because these great projects that we are living with today, when they were planned during the era of resource extraction, they didn't really take into account the individual or cumulative effects on the environment. So as a consequence of that, environmental obligations have been imposed upon those projects retrospectively. Well, that's a very difficult way to manage a water project because the infrastructure is already on the ground, but then its purposes are being asked to be changed. And so that means it's a reallocation. The effect of that has been a significant reduction in the reliability of water to the order where many of the water users in the San Joaquin Valley today can rely on no more than 50% of the surface water supply that they had originally anticipated. On top of that, as we look forward to what will happen in the future, we've looked at a number of climate change models, and the trend in California is fairly well articulated, that the massive snow melt or massive snowpack that we have, which is our largest reservoir in the Sierra Nevada mountain range, will diminish. But that doesn't mean the quantity of water will diminish. What will happen is we will have a lot more rain and a lot less snow. And the rain will occur in periods when irrigation is not going on, and it will overwhelm many of the storage capabilities of our existing infrastructure. So some of that water supply that's currently manageable through snowmelt will become less manageable as it comes off earlier in the season with rainfall. On top of that, the sea level rise that will occur will affect the operation of our projects because we move water through an estuary, the largest estuary on the western coast of North and South America. We force water through it north to south when it wants to move east and west twice a day with tides. In order to do that, there's a water quality requirement that must be maintained in that ecosystem. That means more water with higher sea level, more water would be released to maintain that water quality and less would be available for export. And then the third factor that's really significant is the little graphic I have up in the corner there. The hidden resource in California for years has been groundwater, but it's been completely unregulated until recently. And with the passage of legislation that mandates sustainable groundwater management practices, many of the water users will need to drastically adapt their uses of water. In fact, what's shown in that graphic, those red indications are the most severely impacted areas from groundwater overdraft. And what you'll notice, it's really the entire San Joaquin Valley. And so as the agricultural community looks to this future, it looks pretty bleak and it is very concerning to them. So for years, and I mean for decades, the water utilities, the irrigation districts, the cities, the associations that are collaborative groups among multiple water users have attempted to look at individual projects, new storage projects, modifications in conveyance facilities, development of groundwater banks, changes in the flood control system. And invariably, many of these ideas, which may have merit on face value, have been very difficult to move forward because they've only been incremental solutions to a much larger problem. And the way those solutions have gone forward or been proposed is they would often result in a exchange of benefits as opposed to a growing of benefits. And so in recognition of this, a very large coalition has formed and is committed to a collaborative approach to developing a long-term solution. And so rather than only involving the traditional interests of the water utilities, the water managers, and the direct beneficiaries of that water, this group is much more comprehensive. It's looking at the environmental obligations or the environmental opportunities. If we think about the loss of water supply to the valley, it may be as much as 2 million acre feet per year. Well, that means this land use you're looking at can't be sustained, and some land would need to change. So what's the strategy for changing land use? Should it be patchwork and random, or is there a way of focusing it more around large tracts that can provide ecological value? And so the environment is being represented through a lot of interest groups that are thinking more holistically around environmental needs. But the group also includes small communities, many of which are disadvantaged economically, that have suffered from depleted groundwater levels that have dried out their wells or diminished water quality. And then the other leg on that stool, if you will, is local government, where the role of local government in crafting solutions around water hasn't really been all that prominent in the past. It's been left to the large water managers. And so when we think more comprehensively about these various entities, they all have an important seat at the table. So the way the process is beginning is each of these entities is describing the problem the way they see it. They're all coming up with their own problem statements. But they also have been given the same homework to define the problem as you think the other 4 entities view that problem. And the outcome of that then is an integration of a shared set of issues in the development of a jointly supported problem statement. As Ryan mentioned, the problem well defined is half solved. And so rather than focusing on day one on the infrastructure choices they might want, instead they're focusing on the outcome that they're looking for. And from that then, there will be a more broadly supported assessment of the infrastructure needed to achieve that outcome. So I'm optimistic that this process can produce a more durable outcome and move somewhat away from an environment of combat science and winners and losers toward one of more shared values and mutual benefits.
Great, thank you. Ryan, do you want to take the next one? Why don't you talk to us a little bit about what happens if people don't do some of the things that we were talking about?
Sure, Lisa, and I'm sure permitting's everyone's favorite topic. Hopefully I'm not raising too many folks' blood pressure by bringing it up. And I guess, you know, whether it's a challenge or a success depends on your perspective and maybe your level of patience. But this is more of, I guess, a generalized case study that applies or encountered frequently all over the US. There's a lot of oftentimes either time invested in consternation or frustration regarding the Clean Water Act Section 404 permitting process in the US, or it could be some other, you know, permits in Canada or other county or local or state permits, depending on kind of your biggest issues. But for large and complex water supply projects, you know, this can be obviously a very large hurdle and a high bar for these. And, you know, some of the issues that occur is one, just the sheer length of time that some take, even though it was a success, like here in Texas, there's a couple of new reservoir projects moving forward, Lake Ralph Hall and Murdock Reservoir, but those took around 15 years, you know, in the permitting and planning process. And it's typical for at least large reservoir projects to take, you know, definitely over 10 years. In some cases, it's taken long enough that others have found different solutions, you know, like I know that's been the case somewhat in the Halligan-Seaman project in Colorado, or some projects simply haven't advanced just because there was an inability to demonstrate that the project met the requirements of the permitting agencies, or there was substantial public opposition. I think there's plenty of stories there too, but you know, just simply not paying enough attention to this or investing up front to fully understand the requirements right from the beginning is certainly a pitfall that we want to avoid. And so some best practices for some of these permitting issues are one, to just do our best to respect the process of the resource agencies and the regulators. I mean, we have to remember that permitting is actually seeking permission, and it certainly is a gateway that we can't get past without going through those requirements. And we want to avoid having to redo things a lot. And we don't want to wait until lots of money has been spent to select your preferred project to then figure out how to get the permit. Well, you know, once you know what you want to do, I think the body of information that supports the decision that you're trying to make should be aligned with the information that's needed to obtain the permit. Now, of course, a lot of the environmental factors that go into that should be part of how you're selecting your plans. And so as we work to understand kind of the perspective and the requirements of the permitters, just a couple things to think about. You know, the permitters, the regulators first need to just demonstrate that a kind of a substantiated and quantified water supply needs exist. And oftentimes they want to see that in much more robust detail than you might expect. And that's where you get into the purpose and need. And then they need to demonstrate that a reasonable range of alternatives has been considered. So we're looking at a wide range of alternatives. And then finally, and of course, this is somewhat summarized, and these are some of the big three. Finally, they need to conclude that the selected alternative is actually the least environmentally damaging practicable alternative in order to permit impacts to waters of the United States or wetlands or whatever other resource we may be talking about in other permits. And so once again, kind of how do we approach this? We just simply need to work to design your process according to the regulations and know the hot buttons and preferences of the regulators. You can't necessarily be tied to a specific solution. Focus more on the outcome that you're trying to achieve in a really well defended and quantified need. So even though we know that some things change over time, in this, of course, in this arena, whether it's examples today with the waters of the US definition and what that, what's counted for that, or kind of like the implementation or decision guidance under the recent one federal decision, the previous administration in the US, those things can change, but the actual underlying law itself hasn't changed, and the regulators are still required to select the least environmentally damaging project, even though some of the processes or certain things that count for impacts may move around a bit. So when this is done right, the permitting agencies can actually, once again, be an asset and can help defend that the project has been developed consistent with legal requirements and their accepted guidance, which could help in other possible challenges that may come in the future.
Great, thank you so much. Let's go ahead to one other case study, and this is something that actually has happened. We're going to be looking backwards. So this is about a place that is a rapidly growing Western municipal region. It's tied to a very large watershed. There were and continue to be multiple problems. There's multiple stakeholders. At the time that this process started, which was about 20 years ago, here are some of the specifics. One of the concerns was reservoir operations for a dam that was designed for flood management, but now critical for the region's water supply. Impaired river flows and increasing water temperature concerns, threatened and endangered species, as well as just general stressed habitat. Newly directed state mandates for water conservation, stranded supplies where one district really had access to a good supply and another district not very far away could be having extreme problems and very stressed conditions where they do not have adequate supply. Groundwater depletion and contamination. So these are all the problems that the region was facing. Interestingly, no problem could be solved by a singular group of people. Many of the people who were in the region were able to block the actions of others because they saw that your solution would be harmful to what my need was. So they were constantly blocking each other, either through litigation or through political pressure. Everyone understood that it wasn't sustainable. They understood that the only way everybody was going to get better is if everyone was getting better. It had to be some way of coming together. So what they did was they all agreed that they couldn't live with the current situation. They pulled together a very diverse group of people. That included the business community, who at this point was starting to see implications about what might happen to future economic growth in the region if these problems weren't resolved. The agricultural sector, citizen groups, the environmental community, water managers and utilities, and local governments, land use authorities. And they all got together and said, we've got to do something. We can't continue this way. So they set two co-equal objectives for their work together. They decided they must provide a reliable and safe water supply for the region's long-term economic and just general economic and environmental health, and that they needed to preserve the fishery, wildlife, recreation, and aesthetic values of the watershed. So they entered into this process. It was a very hard process, and I don't want to minimize this. It took them 10 years. So there are probably people thinking, oh my gosh, I don't have that kind of time. But the answer is you don't have the time to not do this, because none of them would have gotten their projects had they not moved forward with this. So a critical part of this process was developing a process agreement and starting an interest-based negotiation. Some of you might have heard stories like this. This beginning part of thinking through how it is you're going to be in a conversation together is extremely important. In fact, there's all kinds of stories about international negotiations where the first 3 months is spent negotiating the shape of the table. So hopefully we don't run out of there in one of these water situations. But yeah, this stuff really matters. They needed to pull people together that were willing to support this financially. It does take work when you're going to support this kind of a negotiation. You have to have some fiscal support for it to manage. You're going to have negotiators, you have to do staff work. All those things have to happen. So people were willing to do that. They did some of the things I've been talking about a little bit earlier. They did the assessments where they went out and asked all those questions. They began to extract that value equation that I talked about when I showed you that orange circle. So they actually did that. They probably weren't using the orange circle, but they were using something similar to that. They began to understand what the issues, conditions, trends, goals, really trying to build, just as Ryan was talking about a minute ago, this common understanding. And Bill was saying the same thing. It's critical to build common understanding, a shared understanding of what the problems are. They did that. They made sure the people at the table were legit. That these people actually could represent and take back a message and make sure that when I made an agreement that it would stick, that it wouldn't be overturned when I went back home to my own constituents. And then they really worked together to design. Structure and process are really important in these types of things. You want to make sure you have an agreement about the way you're going to make decisions. You're going to need to make sure that what you do is systematic. You need to make sure that you're constantly affirming and checking that people are looking at interest-based processes. So when I say hard work, it just was. It required people sitting down and eating together. It required rolling up the sleeves. It required different periods of people being pretty frustrated, and so on and so forth. I know that there were people that got divorced and had babies in the same period of time, people that were at the table. So what happened? At the end of all of this, they were able to come up with some package agreements, and this was really important. Nothing could happen at all the same time. There had to be an amount of trust that was built that allowed for packages to be put together. So my package is going to go first, but I trust you enough, or you trust me enough that I'm willing and I will make sure your package goes next. And that's what they did. So what happened? They got their agreements, they developed their packages, and then something new happened. All of the things I told you that were really falling apart were getting changed. So taking a look at new ways of getting flood management support so that a reservoir reoperation was possible. They were also able to increase the dam height of the storage. They were able to do significant floodplain restoration and, where needed, levee improvements to make sure there was better flow and better temperature management. They were able to build out improved habitat because of some of the other ways that they were managed the rest of the resource. They installed and began operation of new interties for water wheeling. This was a critical element of being able to make sure the entire region was healthy, and those water wheeling, by the way, really has saved the region in severe drought. They've moved to some new and exciting sophisticated groundwater management approaches, including use of FloodMAR, which is flood managed aquifer recharge. And because they have gone to this whole new interdisciplinary integrated approach, they've been able to find new funding sources, new partners, so bringing more money into the region to get their work done. And finally, they've developed new institutions that are able to make sure that these agreements continue to be followed, and to do the new work, they had to do adaptive management. This was all occurred 20 years ago. Things have changed, so that constantly has to be monitored and managed. So these new institutions are helping to make sure that happens. So this is absolutely a success story, and it took exactly the approaches that we're talking about. So with that, I'm going to just kind of turn this back to Bill to talk a little bit about some takeaways, and we'll jump into any questions.
Yeah, and I think I've seen from Ryan that our host that questions are coming in, so I'll keep this part pretty quick so we can get to some of the questions. I think we've all seen what we've talked about today, that we don't mean this in a diminutive way, that the building is the easy part, engineering is hard, and there are some very sophisticated issues to be addressed in engineering. But from the perspective of getting a project implemented, that's the last phase of it, tends to be. And so we've made this a little bit euphemistic, but we From what we're describing today, I think you might say the building is the easy part, getting everyone to agree on what to do is the hard part. And that leads to the importance of partnerships. There are no go-it-alone projects really out there. And in thinking about partnerships, we also have to think about the timing and the compatibility of the partnership needs, that not everybody who has common needs them all at the same time. And so that has to be built into the understanding of what is the problem and what is the solution set going to look like. And that then underscores the crucial importance of thinking about your whole process from the beginning. What is the roadmap? What is the pathway? Who has to be involved? What decisions need to be made, and who will be making those decisions? And what information will they need? And to the greatest extent possible, look to develop common information to support multiple decisions. So with that, Ryan Riddell, let me hand it back to you to facilitate some of the question and answer.
All right, great. Thank you, Bill and presenters. Great topic and discussion. We do have some questions coming in. I'm going to start off with the first one, which is, what do you do if you can't get all your necessary partners to the table? Which I'm sure is a pretty common occurrence for large water supply projects.
Yeah, that's a good question. If you recognize that there are partners that you will need, but they're reluctant to come to the table on day one, you have two choices. You can either behave as though they're not involved and only consider your own interests, or you can behave as though they're already at the table. Because you have to ask yourself, why are they not there? They may not be there because they don't have an immediate need. That could be the case. They may not be there because they don't trust what is being done. In either case, trust is the foundation. And if you have unwilling partners or reluctant, maybe in the case for some partners, it'd be wise to demonstrate to them that your approach is sincere and that your processes can be trusted. And that comes through transparency and outreach. And so even though they may not be active in participating in your project or your activities at this time, it's really incumbent upon the project proponents to engage those who are reluctant, to overcome the underlying barriers, whether it be trust, timing, financial capabilities, or philosophical opposition to the need for the project. So the simple answer, Ryan, from my point of view, would be behave as though they are there.
And I'll add to that, Bill. What I would also say is that it's really important to go back and take a look at that value equation. There's basically two ways to encourage people to move towards change. One of them is to construct a value or a vision of what's possible and bring people into that conversation because it is desirable. The other one is to really understand the potential of a burning platform, which is that it's just hot and we need to move, we need to get off. So by fully understanding what the people's issues and interests are, we can help to construct a world where it makes sense for people to be part of the process. The other thing that we want to look at are who are the stakeholders of those folks and what do they care about. It may be that you aren't the right person to bring them to the table, but there is someone else out there that has an interest in this process working, and they will be the right person to bring them to the table.
Great, thanks, Lisa.
Yeah, great. All right, next question. How do you work collaboratively with regulators when you are concerned they might see the scope larger than you do, or possibly you're not sure you can rely on interim feedback?
Do you want to run with that one, Ryan?
Yeah, I'd be happy to start out on that. I think one of the key things in working with the permitting agencies is to remember that they can't necessarily agree. I mean, their agreement oftentimes comes at the end, but then they can't agree until they see the whole story. I think there's certainly, we can get them aligned and be sharing with them information, whether it be about the modeling and of course getting them out on site, but then it's bringing them along every step of the way. And you just have to trust that that's going to work the best that it can and document that well, but also just treat them like a partner, you know, and don't withhold information from them. You know, don't treat them like an enemy. And I think those are the principles that you really need to work with.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
All right. Anything you want to add there, Lisa?
No, I think that was a great answer.
Okay. Bill, there's a question specific for you. And obviously anyone can answer it, but what is the role of demand management in this chain of decision making, in your opinion?
It's pretty crucial. When maybe building on what Ryan just talked about from the regulators' point of view, if we talk about the example of at least in the US, the Army Corps of Engineers issuing a 404 permit, they don't consider demand management to be a project alternative. They consider it to be a demand reducer. And so there's an expectation that demand management would be a demonstrated component of the need for a water supply development. And so what that really means is the alignment of your demand management practices through the organization as a whole. What are the enacted principles of an organization? What has the board of directors or supervisors agreed to as an approach? What's in your water management plans? How are you actually doing it? So when you think about either conservation, drought management, conservation practices, or long-term demand management through, in the Western US, it's becoming more and more common to look for reduced outdoor irrigation. Of course, we've been looking at higher efficiency indoor appliances for many, many years. There's an expectation that is part of the portfolio, not as an alternative to your project, but part of the basis for why your project is needed in the first place.
Okay. I know we're getting short on time. I'm wondering if there's folks in the audience, there is a little chat area, a little question area. I'm just curious to know what kinds of, as you're in this session and you're hearing what we're talking about, what kinds of problems are you thinking about? What are you looking at where this barrier of getting people to the table is something you've got to be paying attention to? And if you wouldn't mind, I'd appreciate hearing from you, the audience, the kinds of things that you're struggling with right now or what you're concerned about. And I see we've got about 2 minutes left. Ryan, are there any other questions that you wanted to ask or pose?
Yeah, sure. I think this is an interesting one, but how do we convince elected officials, as you said previously, that we need to go slow to go fast?
Well, there's quite a bit of research on that. I'll just offer one of this pre-work is really foundational. I think about it a little bit the way that you think about if you're in agriculture, the fact you need to till the soil, you need to have conditions that are ripe to move forward. And if you just go jumping in, you're absolutely going to get blindsided. You're potentially going to run into some of the problems we talked about with building distrust. You don't have all the information. The full system is not available yet. And you've got information about the system. So at the end of the day, it's kind of like the story I just told you, the integrated water story. They had to spend 10 years so that any of them could have gotten a project. If they all just headed off to take on things on, none of them would have got what they needed. I don't know if you have,
but in that, Lisa, all the participants, and you talked about a very diverse set of participants in that regional solution, all of them recognized the need to work together. Mm-hmm. And so that was then communicated cohesively to the elected officials. One of the challenges we always find with communicating with electeds is the time frame for election cycles doesn't align very well with the time frame for developing complex water solutions. Mm-hmm. And there's a desire for a rapid decision that fits nicely within election cycles sometimes. Mm-hmm. The only way to overcome that is for the electeds to recognize that the community as a whole supports the approach.
Yeah, and I think too, another technique for that is to chunk it out so that you can have interim successes. So that which theoretically you should be able to do through good project design. So exactly. I think we're pretty much done. I'm guessing, Ryan, you've got rules about how you moderate.
Yeah, we we do have some more questions, but we'll follow up with individuals offline. So I think we'll wrap it up here. Thanks to everybody for joining. Really appreciate it. We do have 2 more webinars coming up in July. Please feel free to join us or to recommend to your colleagues or friends if they would be interested in the topics. And again, I will follow up with a certificate of attendance in a week or so. Thanks to the presenters. We really appreciate you taking the time, sharing your knowledge with us, and I hope that everyone has a great day.
Great, thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you
for
all.
joining.
Appreciate you joining us.